Good afternoon. Today is Friday, the 9th of August, 2024, just after 1 o'clock. Welcome to UK Column News. I'm your host, Brian Gerrish. Delighted to have Debi Evans with me in the studio.
Thank you. I'm delighted to be here. Thank you.
Good. Thank you for making it. And also a welcome to Mark Anderson, who'll be joining us by video link from the United States. Now, we decided that we'd stay on the very hot and emotional topic of migration and immigration. And so we'll kick off with this first segment by having a look at how immigration in this country is presented by the media. This is just one of many clips. Let's have a look.
Proof deterrents aren't working as the number of channel crossings tip over 10,000. A new record for this stage in the year as nearly 300 migrants risked their lives on Friday.
You're in the middle of the sea, you look left and right, you don't see any hard thing, right? And almost the water just, getting in the boat.
Kolbasia knows the desperation. He fled in the same way from torture years ago. He helps other victims and says UK politics won't stop the boats.
We know the crossing is dangerous, but we do it anyway because we know that that's the only option that we have. There's nothing that can stop us in order to get somewhere where we feel that we need to get to be safe.
Rishi Sunak's reputation and possibly the election depends on getting immigration under control. But Rwanda deportation flights have been paused. This accommodation there still empty.
We're seeing people who've fled brutal regimes, oppressive wars, who are in limbo. They're not being processed. They're not going to be removed. And all of that means that their accommodation costs will carry on rising. And so whoever wins the next election, this will be the immediate priority. The system is heading for meltdown.
Migration also tricky for Labour. The voters it needs to win back want tougher controls. Keir Starmer promises a border security command.
But nothing has worked so far, and they'll all have to convince people that theirs is the plan that finally makes a difference. There's also a lot of scepticism that Labour will do any better. But immigration is one of the top issues voters care about, so they'll have to.
The Home Office said we continue to work closely with our French partners to prevent crossings and save lives.
So that's a typical news report. What does it try and suggest? It suggests that the problem is simply with immigration as a result of people in rubber boats. There's a few hundred of them. There's thousands of them coming, but that's simply the problem. But of course, that is not the problem because the boat crossings are a tiny, tiny fraction of the overall migration into the country, which is a much more complicated thing to look at, and we're going to try and do that today. Now, Debi, you came up with another video clip here, which is fascinating. Tell us about it.
I did, yes, and I've got a little segment on migration too, which we'll come on to. But while I was looking, I found a very interesting documentary from ARTE, art.tv documentaries, and they've been following migrants in the channel. And I want to introduce you to a slightly different side of the coin. I want to introduce you to Aladdin, who doesn't have a genie, sadly, and Mahmoud. And they are currently in Dover. Have a look at this.
This is a new phenomenon on the English coast. Like Mohammed, more and more are making the return journey. Those let down by the English dream. The young man shares the beach with two friends, Mahmoud, a 26-year-old from Jordan, and Aladdin from Syria. Aladdin arrived in Britain 3 years ago and applied for asylum, but like thousands of others in the country, he is yet to receive a reply. Without documents, he can neither work nor settle. He has no prospects, no life. He decided to leave the hotel he was staying in and has now been living on the beach for 6 months.
I was thinking I'm gonna get my own house, my own room, my own flat. I'm gonna get a job. I'm gonna do a license. I'm gonna get a nice life. But no. You go to London, you find too many homeless people when they are in the same situation, but actually they're scared to go back home, to go back to his country, because he ran away from war. Just stay here and die here. No, I don't want to die here. I don't want to die in your country.
So that's a very different story. And what does it show? Well, it shows, of course, chaos actually in UK, that we can't deal with the problem, but also these people are essentially being used for an agenda. And we're going to come on to that agenda. Let's look at the figures again. We've shown this one before, but let's put it on screen. So this is from the government. Detections at the border, it calls this, by methods of entry. And if you look at small boat arrivals, which is the strongest line on the graph, we're talking in thousands, up to 15,000, up to 20,000 at one point there in 2022. So it sounds a huge amount, but of course we should have a look at this against the massive total for 1 year of over 600,000. Now, the language is important because they talk about irregular immigration by rubber boats. And Debi in a minute is going to talk in a lot more detail about this manipulation of terminology and language, we believe, in order to make an opaque system to migration and immigration so that the public really doesn't understand what's going on. Now, a big thank you to a viewer who actually sent me this clip. It's from the Sun newspaper. It's going back to May the 7th, 2005. The big headline is, "I'll give you 5, rattled Blair unveils plan." He'd been re-elected for the 3rd time, I think it was, but he was suffering with a drop of support amongst Labour voters. But here was his 5 pledges. And number 4 was, quote, to sort out the immigration crisis. The immigration chaos. Now, if we look in the article itself, he said that he'd learned the British are a tolerant and decent people. I think that's a fair statement. But they believe there are real problems in our immigration and asylum system, and they expect us, that's New Labour under Tony Blair, to sort them out. And we will. That's what he said in May 2005. Let's have a look at a couple of clips of Blair speaking on the subject of immigration.
Thank you very much indeed, Debi, and thank you to the CBI and to the London Business School for allowing me to come and make this lecture to you today. And I thank all of you for coming and listening to what is an important subject. Now, I have to say it's one of those subjects where when you tell your senior civil service that you're about to make a speech on a subject like immigration, they say, "What a courageous move, Prime Minister." But there it is. Anyway, here goes. Immigration and politics do not make easy bedfellows. They never have. We need few reminders of what can happen when the politics of immigration gets out of hand. And let us also be very clear that those who warned of disaster back in the 1960s and 1970s if migration was not stopped, who said Britain would never accept or be a multiracial society, have been proved comprehensively wrong. On the other hand, there is no doubt that on the doorstep in local communities, immigration has suddenly become very high in the agenda. Why? It is not, incidentally, an exclusively British issue. This is a worldwide phenomenon. Immigration has dominated elections in countries like Denmark, Austria, and the Netherlands in recent years. Le Pen rose to prominence in France, as we know. In Australia and New Zealand, it has been a central question, sharply dividing the main parties. Migration flows across the world with increased opportunities to travel, and globalization are driving the issue.
So he did actually tell the truth at the end. This isn't a national problem. This is a problem that's been created by the desire for global government, and the migration of people globally is a key weapon in helping create that government. Let's look at the second little clip from his speech.
And beneath the surface, I think we all know as politicians, certainly on the centre left, what we fear: that concern slips into prejudice and becomes racism. But we cannot simply dismiss any concern about immigration as racism. In part, what has put immigration back up the agenda, with public concern at its highest since the 1970s, is that there are real, not imagined, abuses of the system that lead to a sense of genuine unfairness. There were real problems with asylum. Some immigration procedures have clearly been at fault. Some rules introduced for entirely legitimate reasons have been subject to systematic, often criminal fraud. And many of these systems simply need bringing up to date. Then there are high-profile examples of the absurd, not many in number, but very damaging in terms of impact, like radical clerics coming here to preach religious hate, or people staying here to peddle support for terrorism. The combination of all these things, with the reporting of them not exactly calculated to douse the flames of concern, lead to a crunch point, and that, frankly, is where we are now. The vast bulk of the British people are not racist. It is in their nature to be moderate. But they expect government to respond to their worries. They can accept migration that is controlled and selective. They accept and welcome migrants who play by the rules. But they will not accept abuse or absurdity, and indeed, why should they? So I think now is the time to make the argument for controlled migration simultaneous with tackling the abuses we can identify, and then longer term put in place a system that gives us the best guarantee of future integrity in our migration policy. That is why we have begun a top-to-bottom analysis of the immigration system, how it operates, how it can be improved, how it can agree migration where it is in our country's interests and prevent it where it isn't. One thing I should say to you is already clear. The overwhelming majority migrate in, and indeed often out of Britain, fairly and in accordance with the rules. But there are areas of abuse, and we can and should deal with them.
So what he didn't do is say that he was going to put a stop to inappropriate immigration. What he was actually doing was spelling out the real policy, which was for an increase in it. Now, we've shown some of this material before. We do this very quickly. This is the immigration legacy of Tony Blair, and it's showing just some of the policies that he brought in to supposedly deal with immigration. But what was the result from the time that he came into power in 1997, where we had a net flow into the country of 50,000, by 2004-5, it was up to 200,000. So clearly what he said to the public was a lie. And then if we start to have a look at the UK paperwork, the policy documents on immigration, this is where we start to see the strange use of language here. So it's talking about irregular migration. What is irregular migration? It's unlawful migration. And the unlawful migration has not been in rubber boats, because that is such a tiny percentage. The real movement of people up to over 600,000 has come through government-approved migration, which has been a decision that governments, Labour and Conservative, have made without any discussion with the public. And where have their policies come from? Men like this, Sir Peter Sutherland, who I believe, Mark, that you had the pleasure of meeting briefly some years ago.
Yeah, good day, everyone. Yeah, 10 years ago at a Trilateral Commission meeting in Washington, D.C., I happened to get into that meeting. It was semi-open to the public, and I had a brief debate in front of some of his friends with Peter Sutherland. Not exactly a pleasant guy, but a smart guy. Of course, he was head of the World Trade Organization, and I argued, why should Japan grow rice only to export it and then import someone else's rice? And he gave this rather tortuous answer. But I concluded that people like this, moving people around and moving produce around or goods and services, is all the same to them. In other words, they commoditize people, and people are encouraged to migrate and move around the globe in accordance with economic aspirations of the globalists. That's what I got out of it.
Okay, thank you very much for that. Well, if we just pop Peter Sutherland back on screen, the organisation that he was then head of, he's now deceased, but he was then head of the Global Forum on Migration and Development. And what was he saying? That migration would be used to break down the nation state. If we actually have a look at that Global Forum on Migration and Development, this is about bringing nations together to discuss immigration and migration. And if we look at it in very simple terms, this is the killer statement: the contribution of migration to sustainable development. So migration and immigration is being used as a weapon for the sustainable development policies in the world. And we've got dynamic multi-stakeholder dialogue. This is the high-level discussions beyond government, where people like Tony Blair were told what the migration policies were due to be. And at that point, Debi, I'll hand over to you, because you're looking at the murkiness of the pond and the language around migration.
I am, yes. It is a big subject. And what is migration? Well, it's movement. That's essentially what it is. And for migrant workers, skilled workers coming into the UK, we've actually seen a huge decline. So the numbers have fallen from 143,000 in July 2023 to 91,300 in July 2024. From August the 1st to August the 7th, so this is very recent data, there have been 736 arriving in small boats. Now, there's even a definition of a small boat, so that doesn't count the many that come in on bigger boats or come in on cruise liners or in vehicles. So let's just go to the United Nations again for their primary purpose at the end of the day is to maintain international peace and security. And here's the UN Refugee Agency, and they're looking at global trends. So we've got 117.3 million displaced because of conflict, war, violence, or disturbing of public order. That's 1 in 5 are displaced, with 3.6 million new claims at the end of 2023. That's globally. So what are the solutions? So the solutions are, what they're saying is that they're actually returning people to the countries of origin. 6.1 million, they say, with 158,700 resettled. But there are 32,200 stateless people who received citizenship. But what is a refugee? So I had to go to the International Migration Law to look at the glossary, because it is an absolute minefield. This is number 34. Let's go and have a look at I've just literally scraped the top of the iceberg. I've got a few descriptions here because there are so many. So let's look at the first slide, where you've got aliens, asylum seekers. I won't go into the meaning of all of them because I'm just showing a few. There are so many more. I mean, literally probably 50 or 60 more. So we've got alien, asylum seekers, climate migration. We've got climate migrants, migrants in vulnerable situations, displaced people. And then even more, we look at refugees, refugee prima facie, refugee sur place, refugee 1951 convention, refugee mandate. So confused. I wouldn't expect you not to be, to be honest. So what is a migrant? Who is a migrant? So I had to go to the UN again to look at the definition of migrant, and you can see actually that this is an umbrella term. So there's nothing that's defined under international law at all. Very confusing, very mixed picture. So then I went to Amnesty International, and I wanted to look at the difference between refugees, asylum seekers, and migrants, because all of these terms get confused. So if we look at the next slide, it says that really we're looking at people on the move. So a migrant and refugee, this is a term that's used interchangeably, but there is a legal difference. So what are the differences? So a refugee, they've fled their own country because they say they're at risk of serious harm, and they have a right to international protection. However, an asylum seeker has also fled a country because they feel they're at risk, but they haven't been legally recognised as a refugee and are awaiting a decision. So let's look and see what a migrant is, because you can see how confusing this picture is. So a migrant is someone staying outside their country of origin. This means that people, Mark Carney, in fact, anybody can be a migrant or an economic migrant, as we'll come on to see. But if you're coming over to this country or any other country to work or study or join family, then you're classified as a migrant. But there's another type of migrant, and I had to go to another article in The Conversation to find out what the difference is between an economic migrant, because I'm sure you're all saying, oh, but there are economic migrants, and you'd be right. And yet again, if we look into the conversation a bit more, an economic migrant, again, is an umbrella term for people moving. And this is where they use the example of someone like Mark Carney can be an economic migrant, just the same as somebody that's jumping in the back of a lorry or is in a small boat. So migrants that claim asylum have to reach this country before they apply for refugee status. So you can see what they have to do. They have to actually be here to claim asylum. So let's go and look at the UK Gov and let's see what asylum seekers actually get. And I'm just going to run through these very quickly because there's a very handy website that I'll show you in a minute that's got a very good resume of everything. So the UK Government Asylum Support Overview. So what can you get on top of your children being educated and health, NHS? So the next slide will show you that you can get somewhere to live, or you can get a cash allowance. Now you can have a flat, house, hostel, bed and breakfast, hotel, as we've seen, whichever accommodation is available. You get £49.18 a week for each person, or if the accommodation provides meals, that's £8.86. And of course, you do get extra if you're a young mum, or if you're pregnant, or if you've got children. And that's just a little bit of information there. So you can see that if you're pregnant and you're near your due date, you can actually get a £300 one-off maternity grant. But even if you've been refused asylum, it still means that you can stay and you can appeal. And this goes on and on and on. It can span years. But I did find a very handy guide after the OSIP. Sorry, yes, we'll look at the eligibility. So, of course, anyone can ask for asylum, anybody. But then I went to facts4eu.org, very handy website, actually. This is Brexit Facts. They're a think tank. And they've done, on the next slide, a list of annual benefits. So they say that a family of 4 with one child under 1, the total, I won't go into the individual sums because you can see them quite clearly there, but the annual benefits a family could see would total up to £14,698 a year. And they say they don't pay rent, income tax, national insurance contributions, council tax. I'm not quite sure where the mobile phone comes from. And of course, they don't pay prescription. But they do make a very important observation in this report. And the observations are on the next slide. And that says that this is really a report. Their report is about illegal migrants. They want to make that quite clear. These are boat economic migrants is what they're saying. So if you are a migrant and you're coming into this country, what kinds of help can you get? Well, you can get quite a bit of help, especially if you're LGBTQI plus, and if you've experienced sexual-based violence and abuse. What do they provide? Well, they provide practical and emotional support and also legal advice, which I could imagine would be very handy for somebody that's just arrived into the country. The next slide is also more support. I think you've got the next slide there for migration. Oh, sorry, those are the funders. Yes, those are the funders of the LBGTQ. So you can see this is National Lottery, Barrow Cadbury Trust, and a bunch of others. And there is other support as well. So the next slide will show you that there's a Migrants' Rights Network charity. So plenty of help for people if they do need them. But I just want to end this segment on quite a pertinent piece, I think, because I'm sure many of you will be saying, oh, yes, but where are these migrants going and what are they trained in doing? And we mustn't forget that the UK has given the UN peacebuilding crisis a boost to help prevent humanitarian crisis and conflicts. They've actually boosted it by £10 million and a further £2 million to build a national capacities for conflict prevention. With 160 million that they've invested, the UK government's invested since 2006, it actually makes the United Kingdom one of the biggest donors for the UN peacekeeping. But we'll talk more about it in extra, I'm sure.
Thank you for that, Debbie. Well, there we are, a complete soup of terminology, so many different definitions. Think of the complexity for the civil service trying to even deal with this number of people, over 600,000. This is deliberately created chaos. This is not accidental. This is a policy created by the government in order to bring people into the country and to deceive the existing population, however long you've been here. And I want to say to our audience that some time ago I was able to talk to members of the immigrant population in this country, and they themselves, of course, recognised that you could not have unlimited immigration into this country at this level, because they suffer, their children suffer, and their grandchildren suffer. And of course, they are perfectly capable of working that out for themselves, as anybody else can within the UK. Now, Mark, let's bring you in, because, of course, we touched on it. The idea of human beings as being commodities brings us to how the money system of the world is run.
Indeed, that is so true. And in extra, I can talk a little bit about Texas and the United States in terms of migration and things like that. Anyway, a few weeks back, I did an advance notice on a seminar in Adelaide, Australia, based on some of the idea of C.H. Douglas, a British engineer. And it has to do with the Douglas social credit and monetary democracy, economic democracy movement that began in Australia, New Zealand, and other crown dependencies around the early 20th century. Anyway, this is from the Australian League of Rights. And one of their quotes, of course, is from the British statesman Edmund Burke: "All that's necessary for the triumph of evil is for good men to do nothing." The blogger in Canada, Henry Makow, added, "All that's necessary for the triumph of evil is to give good men high-paying jobs, and then they won't challenge the system," which is a rather astute observation. Anyway, moving on, I'll also be talking more in the future. There's another conference coming up from the American Monetary Institute in latter September, the 2024 International Monetary Conference, a similar school of thought, though not identical, to the Douglas School of Thought. And that has to do a lot with a law that was born 20 years ago, the American Monetary Act. Now, it was never voted into law, but it was legislation in Congress about 10 or 11 years ago, approximately, by Dennis Kucinich, the noted Ohio former congressman who was RFK Jr.'s media guy and campaign promoter for president for a short amount of time. Anyway, there'll be more on UK Column in the not too distant future on the American Monetary Institute and the American Monetary Act. So that's just a preview of coming attractions there. Now we'll move on from there. And going back to the Australian seminar that just wound up in mid-July, the topics overall were William Waite, The Rise of Useless Work; Professor Zimmerman, Elective Dictatorship or Constitutional Monarchy; Charles Pinwell, which was read by Dr. Oliver Haydorn, an outline of corrective economic approaches; Dr. Oliver Haydorn himself, Untying the Gordian Knot; the one I'm going to focus on today by a Middle Eastern monetary reform expert, Arindam Basu, The Right to Cash. I'll be talking about that in a minute. Professor Tim DiMuzio, Capitalism, Money, and Sabotage. Of course, that's talking about a species of capitalism, monopoly capitalism, not to be confused with free enterprise. And Robert Balzola, Enforcement of Justice, the Magna Carta Tradition. That's an overview of the topics from the recent Australian seminar. Now, The Right to Cash by the Middle Eastern writer Arindam Basu. I give the website there where people can read the entire article. A colleague of the Australian League of Rights actually read that article as a speech at the Adelaide seminar. And this is from that speech. And I copied this over so I could get the exact wording. I won't get into all the detail, but it gets into some definitions. Money, Douglas was quoted as saying in his book, Economic Democracy, that money is, quote, any medium which has reached such a degree of acceptability that no matter what it's made of and no matter why people want it, no one will refuse it in exchange for his products or services. Commodity money, money comprised of precious metals. Fiat money, all non-commodity money. Physical money, all money that's tangible. At present, this primarily consists of notes and coins. Digital money, and this is important as the world moves towards central bank digital currencies, which is all intangible money. An important point is that while all commodity money is physical money and all digital money is fiat money, all physical money is not commodity money. People can freeze the slides and read those things again, of course. We may therefore classify all money into three categories. One, commodity money, metallic money such as coins in gold, silver, bimetallic standards, and so on. Two, physical fiat money, banknotes as well as coins that are outside of metallic standard. This is what we mean by cash. And digital money, intangible money such as numbers in bank ledgers, and increasingly electronic bits and bytes on computer networks of the financial system. Central bank digital currencies are being developed briskly. Now, before I go to the next slide, let me mention, Brian, that the move towards central bank digital currencies, in other words, total digitalization of money and transactions, if that happens in a complete and comprehensive enough fashion, could make proper monetary reform almost impossible. It might put it outside our reach. It's not, I'm not going to say that with total certainty, but if it goes all digital, central bank digital currencies all the way worldwide, it'll be much more difficult to institute something like the Bradbury Pound and actually institute it and have a specific plan on how to implement it. Maybe it won't be impossible, but it'd be much more difficult. Now, moving back to the overall presentation, the lecture that was read on the right to cash included these seven essential points: the right to hold cash, the right to be paid in cash, the right to use cash in all offline transactions, the right to pay governments in cash, such as taxes, the right to deposit cash in banks and similar organizations, the right for easy convertibility of digital money to cash, and the right to sufficiently high denominations so you don't have such high bulks of money and you can still have a large amount of money, you might say. Anyway, continuing from the same lecture based on Mr. Bessu's writings, this is very important. The global drive to eliminate physical money is well worth viewing in a wider context. As Russian scholar Andrei first noted, from the 1990s, a section of the Western ruling class has pressed for a 3D policy of deindustrialization, derationalization, and depopulation, I would also add dehumanization and demoralization to that list. And anyway, this is for the goal to retain and indeed extend control over the general public. To these three, we can add a fourth one. In my book, is the sixth or seventh one. Dematerialization and the push for all digital currency is one example of this. Dematerialization is defined here as the production of goods and services with less material used than before, and that's not always a bad thing, but you can't go too far with it. A distinction is between limited and total dematerialization. Limited dematerialization means the partial reduction of physical resources used to produce something, but total dematerialization entails the elimination of a tangible form altogether. In other words, digitalization. So you might think of, we used to have CDs to have Microsoft Word and Microsoft Office and things like that. And now we have to lease those things. And we've had books that were first hardcover, then books were soft cover, and now we have ebooks and Kindle and things like that. So tangible products that you can actually own and hold in your hand across the board are giving way to this dematerialization, you might say. It's an interesting concept to consider, and we wonder only how far it might go. But anyway, that is a important and oftentimes lesser covered angle on the whole monetary matter. The right to cash, what it means to have cash, and what it would mean for cash to be eliminated altogether. The outcome could become quite dire if we're not careful. Now, moving on a little bit more, I got just a little bit more to show. These slides are based on some people I've interviewed and met over the years. Ellen Brown, who has a law degree. She wrote a noted book called The Web of Debt. Some of our viewers might be familiar with this one. And she gets into some important points, namely, not only is virtually the entire money supply created privately by banks, but a mere handful of very big banks is responsible for a massive investment scheme known as derivatives, which now tallies in the hundreds of trillions of dollars. The banking system has been contrived so that these big banks always get bailed out by the taxpayers, but the scheme has reached its mathematical limit, she argues. There isn't enough money in the entire global economy, she says, to bail out the banks from a massive derivatives default today. And there's just a tad more. I've also, of course, on numerous occasions met G. Edward Griffin, founder of the twice annual Red Pill Expo. I might be covering the next expo this coming November, that is, in Tulsa, Oklahoma. He's written the seminal book that many consider a classic, The Creature from Jekyll Island. I've learned a lot from that, as well as Douglas's writings and Ellen Brown's writings, all very informative. And right here in the UK, in your country there's John Briggs. I've talked to him a few times. He's written this book, Alice and the Money Tree. It kind of uses rhyme and verse and poetry to get into what's wrong with the money system. And there's one interesting point that's made in here, that the result of this system is that the West is drowning in what he calls fake state and private debt, meaning that the debts have a certain amount of illegitimacy to them and need to be largely repudiated and not paid. So those are some of the key sources that I've used, but by far they're not the only ones, Brian, to sort out this very difficult puzzle known as the monetary system. So back to you.
Summary there, and of course it's the money power which controls the political power, and this is why all of us, every individual, whether in UK or worldwide, needs to understand how this corrupt monetary system works. Now, if you like what the UK column is doing, please support us. We would like you to become one of our loyal monthly members, because it's your financial support that keeps us going, and we would like to expand. Please share our material. That's why we produce it, but give us some recognition, please. Facebook still doesn't like us, but we're looking to see whether we might get back on the channel. You can also help us, whether you're a member or not a member, by making a purchase from the UK column shop. And I'd just very quickly like to say that we've had some really lovely emails in these troubled times thanking us for the news reports that we're doing, and saying that they enjoy watching the UK column news, as the person does here. They're also saying that they agree with us that things are speeding up, which I'm sure they absolutely are. So, dear Brian and team, many, many thanks for your amazing presentation of the news so far this week. It could not have been easy, but I appreciated all your delivery, and it was understandable that everyone was a little subdued. I'm here in Canada, although originally from the north of England. So people worldwide thanking us. People can freeze that to read all the detail. This one is interesting, Mark, because it's somebody saying they went into their Santander bank recently in southwest London, and they were shocked to see they'd closed 3 counters. The result was that people were queuing up to try and get money, but it was amazingly difficult to do so. But the bank was solving the problem by conducting a customer survey to find out what problems the customers were having. No, we can't make this up. And we'd also like to say, if you haven't got your Agenda 21, Your Life in Their Hands booklet, please do consider buying one through the UK column shop, because there's a lot of really good information about the global political agenda in this document. Now, if you haven't seen this interview with Diane McCaddy and Craig Houston, please have a look, because here is a very sensible man talking about why he intends to stand for election and his recommendations for ordinary people with common sense to effectively take on the politicians who seem to be out of their minds. We've also got Health Revolution episode 4 up. This is about health, in particular pregnancy and birth issues, with Clive Carl and Nikita Stark. So have a look at that. Promoting the Freedom Music Festival for 2024. That's 23rd to the 26th of August. And of course, that's with the Hope team in Sussex. Lots of good music. And also, if you haven't bought a ticket yet, we encourage you to get it on board with the early bird tickets for UK Columns on Location in Bristol, the 19th of October. This year, we're looking forward to meeting people, and we will have some good speakers. And of course, the UK Column is very happy to promote peaceful protests. And this is 12 o'clock Parliament Square, Wednesday, the 4th of September, where we will be heard during Prime Minister's questions. So if you fancy getting up to London for that, I'm sure you're going to meet some good people. Now, Debbie, over to you. The subject is Yvette Cooper, MP, the illustrious Home Secretary.
It is our illustrious Home Secretary. But before we go to our Home Secretary, I think we've got a little bit of video of her boss, Sir Keir Starmer, our Prime Minister, with the immigration row, racism, riots. What did he say 10 months ago before he was elected? Have a look at this. Oh, we don't seem to have it. Don't worry, we'll skip on. We'll maybe come back to that in extra, if that's okay. So let's look at Yvette Cooper. She is our Home Secretary, but who is she? So she started as a policy advisor, actually, with John Smith way back when, and she's risen through the ranks. She's worked with the Clintons in the USA, and she's also worked under our very own Tony Blair. But David Curtin put a very interesting tweet up this week, and I thought I would just deep dive a little bit more. He says, he references the Fabian WEF, young global leader that is currently occupying the position of UK Home Secretary, is to spend 29,400,000 of British people's money to protect mosques after the murder of 3 white children in Southport. So I was curious when I went back to the Telegraph to see the reference to the young global leaders. And there we have Yvette and her husband. I'm sure you'll remember her husband. We'll come on to him in a minute, Ed Balls. They both attended to represent the UK government's 1 million young global leader projects. So we've got that reference. And then I went to look at the Fabian Society, as you do. And of course, Ben has been looking in depth at the Fabian Society, and we can see that Yvette has plenty of dealings with the Fabian Society. That's one of her speeches. And the next slide actually is just another example of her speech, Pathway to Power, where she talked about new politics, kinder, democratic. Well, I'm not sure that they are terribly kind. It's also interesting to know that Yvette is member of Labour Friends of Israel, and we've just got a slide here to show you some of the articles that she's done that. I mean, there's loads on that website with regards to many of our politicians at the moment, so please do go and have a look. And in 2023, she and her husband, Ed Balls, were the 26th most powerful political couple in the United Kingdom. So that's reassuring to know, isn't it? And of course, let's look at her husband, Ed Balls. I took this little slide. Oh, sorry. Yes, we'll look at his biography first, because he's kind of everything now, isn't he? He was our Chancellor of Exchequer. He was Education Secretary. And now he's come dancing. He's a celebrity. He's also a presenter on Good Morning Television. And I'm sure we'll come to that in a minute as well. But when you look back, both of them have had their fair share of scandals. So this is flipped homes. Apparently they flipped their homes. This is back in 2009. Apparently they flipped their homes 3 times, I think it was, in 2 years. But the article does go on to say that they were exonerated. And then I've got a very interesting little slide. I think we've got one of Ed Balls with fire behind him. And I was interested because I thought, oh, fire with Ed Balls, what's this all about? Well, apparently when he was dancing in his Come Dancing stint, he was dancing so much in the kitchen that he actually broke the cooker. So I just thought it was an interesting slide with the fire. I'm sure you'll appreciate the symbology there. And I also want to point out that both of them, husband and wife, are current members of the Privy Council. We mustn't forget about that either. So we've witnessed our Home Secretary getting very cross at the public. She's almost sounding like a headmistress, I'm thinking. She was very cross. She was very angry with behaviour. She was very angry with language that had been used to police, to politicians, and to other members of the public. And so I just want to show you this little article that I found in the Mail online. So this was revealed: a trans activist who heckled Nadim Zahawi off Warwick University campus is actually the son of Ed Balls and Labour Shadow Home Secretary Yvette Cooper. This is Joel Cooper. They have 3 children, and Joel's the only son. He heckled Nadim Zahawi. He's a trans activist, and he called him a transphobe and Tory scum, which I don't think is terribly polite. But I've got a few little pictures of Joel here, because Joel has also done drag acts at Warwick University. There's his proud mum and dad there, and pictures of him there looking very pretty with eye makeup on. And as I say, he's already been involved in a drag act at Warwick University too. So he's quite an active trans activist. But that's not the only problems they've been getting themselves into recently, because they've been keeping it in the family. And Ofcom have been absolutely deluged, as many of you may have seen, when Ed Balls decided that he would interview his wife, the Home Secretary, on Good Morning Television about the riots. And, well, I'm ever so sorry, but hold on tight. Here's a short clip just to show you if you did miss it.
Can I ask, because we've talked about this a few times in the last few days, like many of our viewers will have done at home since those terrible killings in Southport, there have been identifiable individuals on social media who have been inciting not just riot, but violence. They've been using racist language. They've been using falsehoods about what happened in Southport. This is happening on the social media platforms. What can be done, what should be done now by the social media companies and the police and the government to stop this happening? Because it's been happening for a week.
Well, you're right, Ed, that we have seen these things that are appearing online that are clearly criminal. That social media has put rocket boosters under the far-right extremist organisation, and also some of the violence that we have seen.
So that has generated a lot of public opinion, as you can probably imagine, and Ofcom have absolutely been drowned out, quite rightly. But I just want to remind you, when it comes to the riots, when it comes to prisoners and prison, let's just remind ourselves of what our Prime Minister has been saying, because he's actually been saying that he's going to send fewer people to prison. In fact, he's going to let out convicted prisoners early, mainly because the infrastructure is so bad, but he's going to let people out early. But he's going to show full force of the law in the next slide to the people that have been rioting or causing disruption within the community. Not only is he going to put them into prison very quickly, but he's going to make sure 500 new prison cells are going to be open. And I'd like to ask where those 500 prison cells have actually come from. Have they come from the early releases? And as a final, I just want to remind you of, we have shown you this before, but I wanted to remind you of Crisis Cast. Now, Crisis Cast are, they do simulations of crisis incidents. They have specialist teams, and they work with a number of very important people, as you will see here. I mean, I'm not going to go through all of them, but you can see Deloitte, you can see the Army, you can see the National Counter-Terrorism Security Office, CERN. So a lot of acting and crisis simulations going on. Perhaps we can discuss that more in extra too.
Thanks very much. Well, it doesn't give us any confidence at all, not in the leadership of
Acting in crisis simulation.
Prime Minister. Politicians, they need to be replaced. Okay, crisis. Well, that's certainly the Middle East. So, Mark, let's bring you back on. And I think you've got some interesting things to tell us about Greater Israel.
Yes, indeed. The idea of Israel being expansionist beyond its current borders is a theme that's come up many times over the decades, and it's largely attributed to the radical Zionist movement. Well, if it's only a radical fringe or only part of the overall Israeli policy, why is the image of a greater Israel popping up everywhere? The slide to the left here was off social media. Of course, the British government tells us you can't trust anything there unless it's their own. But I thought, well, is that real? And then the slide to the right comes from the Times of Israel, the actual Jewish press. So evidently it is. And the headline there is Smotrich. This is a financial minister under Netanyahu. He says there's no Palestinian people, no such thing, he claims, but he declares his family are the real Palestinians. But how can there be real Palestinians if there are no Palestinian people to begin with, right? What's his logic? Anyway, this is also from the Times of Israel, which, by the way, the Jewish press will oftentimes reveal more about what's going on in the Israeli government than the Western press overall. And it's kind of an ironic thing. But anyway, speaking in Paris at a private memorial service for prominent right-wing Likud activist and Jewish Agency board member Jacques Kupfer, who passed away after a battle with cancer, this finance minister under Netanyahu, Mr. Smotrich, said there was no such thing as Palestinians because there's no such thing as the Palestinian people, quote unquote. A rather bold remark, I might add. A comment that was met with applause and cheers from attendees. Do you know who are the Palestinians? Asked the head of the ultra-nationalist religious Zionism party and Israel's finance minister. This is, of course, Mr. Smotrich. I'm Palestinian, he said, also mentioning his grandmother who was born in the northern Israeli town of Metula 100 years ago, et cetera, et cetera. And I highlighted the part Smotrich was speaking from a podium that featured a map of Greater Israel that included the territory of modern-day Jordan, in accordance with the hardline aspirations by some early Zionist groups. And I put the link down there if others want to see the entirety of this article by the Times of Israel. Mr. Smotrich has a history of making inflammatory statements, says the Times of Israel, against Palestinians, against Arab citizens of Israel, against non-Orthodox Jews, and against the LGBTQ community, including once declaring himself, quote, a proud homophobe, and so on and so forth. And it's interesting how the Israeli press will come down on Mr. Smotrich for these right-wing views, but the United States government will not do the same. Even though the United States government will tell you that any other right-wing government on earth is something to be feared or something to be dealt with in a very stern manner. It's funny how the Israeli state, being labeled right-wing, gets a pass, and they can basically do whatever they want. But if you're Viktor Orban or any other right-wing government, you're something to be feared. You're a menacing entity. Anyway, the image on the podium of Mr. Smotrich, the finance minister, is not the only place where the image of Greater Israel is popping up. This social media item here shows Israeli soldiers wearing a badge on their uniform, showing a map of Greater Israel, which includes parts of Egypt, Saudi Arabia, Iraq, Syria, and Lebanon. Greater Israel in its entirety includes the entirety of Palestine, the entirety of Jordan, parts of Iraq, parts of Lebanon, parts of Syria, parts of Egypt and Turkey, and even parts of Saudi Arabia. Now, that might seem like an unrealistic thing for Israel to achieve, but it's interesting that it's even on some of the Israeli uniforms, which does indicate kind of an ideological goal, if you will, a geopolitical goal. And this is from Roya News, offering further confirmation that this is happening. Greater Israel map display, soldiers' uniform patch raises alarm. And we'll keep moving from there. This is from that same source. The image of the soldier with the controversial patch surfaced on social media, quickly igniting a storm of reactions, we're told here. Critics argue that the map reflects an expansionist agenda, and get the irony here, reminiscent of historical imperial ambitions, drawing comparisons to Nazi Germany's concept of Lebensraum, or living space. The concept of Greater Israel is rooted in certain interpretations of Zionist ideology, which assert the biblical promised land, extends from the Nile River in Egypt to the Euphrates River in Iraq. This interpretation has been a subject of contention since the founding of the Israeli occupation, with proponents viewing it as a fulfillment of religious prophecy and critics, however, condemning it as a justification for territorial expansion at the expense of neighboring states' sovereignty. So there's a lot of implications here, but it's something that has gone largely unreported, Brian. And one wonders if in the dusty blueprints of the Israeli state, or maybe not so dusty blueprints, whether this is the ultimate goal of Israeli military maneuvers right now, and what's going on in Gaza and what led to that has been largely just an excuse or a springboard for that. Of course, time will tell. It may seem doubtful in a way, but it's something to keep a very close eye on. Netanyahu is not getting any younger, and he wants to keep that foreign aid from the United States flowing in. And we'll just see if this becomes a reality, if Israel would flex its muscle that much. But it's interesting where this is popping up, and we'll see where it goes.
Mark, thank you very much for that. Extremely interesting. And I just want to end that segment by saying that a couple of days ago, I put out a request for members of the Jewish community to talk to the UK column. We've been finding it very difficult to get members of the Jewish community to engage. We know that people who are Jewish but are challenging policies of their own government, many of them are frightened of their own government, which has been an astonishing thing for me to learn. But we have been contacted by some individuals, and I just wanted to say, if there's any members of the Jewish community watching today, thank you for making contact with the UK column, and we will be in contact with you very shortly. Now, I'm just going to give a brief mention to the situation in Ukraine, because a lot of people have got quite animated that the Ukrainians have had a successful attack over the northern border with Russia, and they've been effectively able to move some miles into Russian territory. But first of all, I just want to bring people's attention to the BBC, because I pointed out over many months how Ukraine has dropped down the BBC's priority order. So on that top banner there, Ukraine has now dropped to number 6. And the BBC was almost failing to report on the war because of the continued losses of Ukrainian territory over recent months and the perilous status of the Ukrainian nation. But yes, now we have this cross-border attack. This has boosted BBC reporting, and of course they're getting very excited. Now, I haven't got time to go into this. I want to give a big thanks to the really excellent analysts on social media. This is Defence Politics Asia. There's a whole cluster of them. I try and choose different ones, but this map was particularly good at illustrating the Ukrainian incursion into Russian territory in the direction of Kursk. The latest reports that I've seen are that although there has been some localized expansion of this area, Russian reinforcements are now moving into the area pretty quickly. And my prediction is that the Russians will ultimately crush this incursion with extremely heavy Ukrainian losses. But is it an embarrassment to President Putin and the Russian military? Absolutely. But we'll see how this pans out over the weekend. Now, I'm just going to jump through a little bit here because we have an eye on the clock. Debbie, you've got a little bit to tell us about the NHS.
I have, yes. And I have got a couple of bits of videos. So perhaps we'll just show one for the news and maybe we'll save one for extra. So we'll show the first one first. But the NHS board meeting, there's been lots of board meetings, MHRA as well. We will come on to that, I promise you, next week. And June Rain is still there. But with regards to the NHS, it's vaccine dominated, of course, the NHS board meeting. But there was one member of the board who was just asking for a friend, is it okay to give all the jabs together? Because really, it's a lot cheaper. It is safe, isn't it? Asking for a friend.
Asking for a friend? Co-administration. We talked last year. There was a big push on co-administering flu and COVID vaccines. It worked extremely well, but there wasn't a huge push publicly for that. So confidence in public from having co-administration of vaccines. I'm thinking of those pregnant women being offered 4 vaccines, and the over 75s will be offered 3 this winter. I think the comms on this is massively important because, to be candid, the efficiency to the NHS is massive. Giving 3 or 4 vaccines simultaneously costs a fraction of giving 3 or 4 separately. And it is, in my experience, generally, and I'd like to hear it from you, completely safe to do so. The immune system is very, very good at it, but how we build confidence in people, which will allow us to vaccinate far more people swiftly and effectively.
Vaccinate far more people, far more quickly, all at once, because it's cheaper. I'll leave that there, perhaps.
You've got another video, though.
I have got another video. Do you want to do that now, or do you want to save it for extra? Should we do it now? Okay, so the second video from the NHS board meeting is a gentleman called Steve Russell. Now, he was the CEO of an NHS trust. He's not a doctor. He's not a medical professional, but he is the chief delivery officer of the vaccination programme. And here he is highlighting, after he's highlighted that vaccines are the most effective public health intervention after clean water. But let's hear what he says about the vaccine strategy that you're all going to hear about very soon.
In late 2023, a vaccine which has gone through a number of clinical trials was authorised for use by the MRHA, which is the body that tests the safety of vaccines. And the vaccine that's been authorised and chosen for use has the potential to reduce those hospitalisations and deaths by up to 80%. So that again is really quite significant, both in terms of protection, but also the wider NHS picture. So this is a really important kind of, Amanda used the phrase, all-in piece for the NHS. We are mobilising we will start to deliver the campaign at quite a big pace. We've had quite a short amount of time to plan it, but it will start in September, and there are 2 parts to it. The first part is a service to protect infants, so newborns and infants. That is going to be delivered by offering pregnant women a vaccine at around 28 weeks. And so those women who are pregnant on the 1st of September and are 28 weeks plus will be offered the vaccine. That will be delivered largely through maternity providers.
Now, I just want to double highlight that this is the RSV, the Arexvy vaccine that they plan on giving to pregnant women and newborn babies. And this is going to start from September. So that's 2 clips of the NHS board meeting, but I really would advise anybody who wants to go and hear what is going to happen this winter. There's a few diamonds buried in that board meeting, the recent one in July.
Okay, thank you for that. And we're just going to end on, well, what does this show? To me, this shows the final decline of UK. This is why we have so many problems in the country, because the policies being enacted are simply mindless.
Well, Brian, yes, this is finally a transgender civil servant is wearing fetish gear to Whitehall. Saoirse Amathea Tweedle, I think the name is, has been wearing fetish clothes, and the Department of Work and Pension staff have objected. The Telegraph does go on to say that Baroness Jenkins has got involved in this now, because she wants to ask what policy dress code do civil servants have, because it would appear that this particular individual wants to wear a gothic choker with a pentagram, fishnet tights, low-cut black corsets and high heels. I can't say that I would be wearing that to work personally, anytime.
Pretty incredible. And I will end today's news by saying we were informed some time ago reliably that a police trainee candidate training in the London area is attending police training on particular days, identifying as a fox, because this is his particular comforting activity. And If you believe this is not true, I'm just going to say to you this came from a source within the police force themselves. There's been huge consternation about it. This is the breakdown, the final breakdown of UK. This isn't stupid policy that has come out of the minds of the general public. This is orchestrated, vindictive policy from within the political circles to break down society at all levels. Can it be stopped? Yes. What do we need to do? We need to stand together and challenge it at every opportunity. We'll end the news there. Debbie, thank you very much for joining me in the studio. It's been really great. And also, Mark, thank you for joining us. If you're a member of UK Column, please stay with us. We will be back shortly for UK Column Extra. Thank you for joining us. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.